The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Afterword. In the early 1920s, Wyndham Lewis began work on an impossibly ambitious work entitled The Man of the World. This was planned as a multi-volume work spanning a number of genres, including fiction and non-fiction. Hugh Kenner's description of it as a sort of prose Sistine ceiling captures both the scope of the project and Lewis's titanic ambitions for it. T.S. Eliot, writing to Lewis in 1925, had a less flattering description of Lewis's manifold ambitions at this point. I have felt very strongly that it would be in your own interest to concentrate on one book at a time and not plan 8 or 10 books at once, and I have endeavored to intimate this. And Eliot, more practical and focused than Lewis as always, was right, at least in the sense that The Man of the World was abandoned and never published in anything like its planned form. Yet Eliot was also wrong, for a number of massive works that began as parts of The Man of the World were published separately between 1926 and 1930. 4 of these fragments, if one can use the term fragments for works of 400 to 900 pages, are particularly important in Lewis' oeuvre. 2 works of non-fiction, The Art of Being Ruled, 1926, and Time and Western Man, 1927, and 2 works of fiction, The Childermass, 1928, and The Apes of God, 1930. Published sequentially but composed in overlapping stages across the 1920s, these 4 works are the most difficult and complex books Lewis ever wrote. They are also the most uncompromising, insisting upon their own method of procedure and their own, unsparing vision of the world and of modern society. If they do not quite add up to a Sistine Chapel in prose, they are nonetheless one of the major monuments of modernism, at once an exemplar of modernism and the first and still perhaps most penetrating critique from within of the entire modernist enterprise. So in a sense Lewis's design in The Man of the World was at least partially realized, for these 4 works are best understood and approached together. This has long been intuited by readers of Lewis, and Hugh Kenner in 1954 commented that the unfinished Childermass, 1928, is simply The Art of Being Ruled dramatized. 3. I would modify that somewhat. The first part of the Childermass reflects the metaphysics of time and Western man as clearly as the second reflects the political theater of The Art of Being Ruled. In the same spirit, The Apes of God fictionalizes much of the critique of modern society articulated in both The Art of Being Ruled and Time and Western Man, and the 2 books of non-fiction interpenetrate at many points as well. J. liked to think of these 4 related works as the 4 towers of Lewis's work. More forbidding and less easily likable than his other works, they nonetheless express the core of his vision, and they need to be understood before the concerns of the others fall into place. Readers of Lewis have tended to concede the importance of the 4 towers but leave them unconquered nonetheless. The Apes of God is well known if only because of the scandal it caused when published in 1930, but most readers find Lewis's subsequent compromise with conventional fictional modes in novels such as The Revenge for Love, 1937, and Self-Condemned, 1954, to be more successful. Many people mention The Apes, but few actually read it. The Childermass receives perhaps more attention as the first volume of The Human Age, generally thought to be Lewis's greatest work. But the second and third volumes, Monstragae and Malign Fiesta, 1955, receive much more attention than the Childermass, whose first 100 pages W.B. Yeats, no stranger to difficult texts, described as the most obscure piece of writing known to me. Time and Western Man continues to be cited for its literary criticism in the first 100 pages, the unforgettable critiques of Joyce, Pound, and Gertrude Stein. However, much less attention is ever paid to the second half of the book, where Lewis leaves literary criticism behind for the more abstract realm of metaphysics. So the attention these books have received has been in every case at something of a tangent from the book's central concerns. However, they have been showered with attention compared to The Art of Being Ruled, the first published and arguably most important of the 4. And this has been true from the time of their publication. None of the 4 was a bestseller, but The Art of Being Ruled sold worst of all. Of the 1,500 copies of the English edition published in March 1926, only 323 copies had sold by May 23 and 505 had sold by August 31, 1926. No sales records remain for the American edition published in August of 1926, but 550 unbound sheets of the American edition, also of 1,500, were destroyed in 1929. So this massive work sold somewhere between 500 and 2,500 copies, probably no more than 1,500. Nor can The Art of Being Ruled be said to have been a great critical success, even among close allies of Lewis. Yeats, despite finding the Childermass so obscure, highly praised Time and Western Man, the Childermass, and the Apes of God as they were published, but he never mentioned The Art of Being Ruled. £5, despite being pilloried in Time and Western Man, thought The Apes of God worthy of comparison to Ulysses and the only novel in English that had advanced beyond Ulysses. His reaction to The Art of Being Ruled, however, was considerably less positive, if also insightful. It would be hypocrisy fair me to say that books all about everything in general are of any interest to me in particular. Only T.S. Eliot, of Lewis's close associates, saw the importance of The Art of Being Ruled. Writing in the Criterion in 1926, Eliot listed 6 works that he thought best exemplified the classicism he wanted the Criterion to stand for. In the next issue, despite the problems that he as editor had been having with Lewis as a contributor, he added the newly published The Art of Being Ruled to that list. However, Eliot never went on to write about The Art of Being Ruled as he did about One Way Song and Monstre Guy. And though The Art of Being Ruled is an important influence on his own social and political thought, his commendation of it as an exemplification of Eliotic neoclassicism has probably lessened rather than increased interest in it, since it is a book far more interesting on its own terms than as an exemplification of classicism. The Art of Being Ruled is a key work in Lewis's development, both as his first work of political and social criticism and as a key to the concerns and concepts of other, better-known works such as The Childermass and The Apes of God. But if it is a key to Lewis's oeuvre, it has been a largely neglected key. Egil Rickword, almost alone among the book's initial reviewers, claimed for it an importance in terms Lewis would have appreciated. The Art of Being Ruled should stand towards our generation in the same relation that Culture and Anarchy did to the generation of the 70s. One indication of the importance Lewis assigned it is to be found in the attention paid it in his later Root Assignment, 1950. In the section devoted to a retrospective discussion of his own works, vastly more space is devoted to The Art of Being Ruled than to anything else, 27 pages as compared to the 4 on Time and Western Man, for example. But he paid so much attention to The Art of Being Ruled in Root Assignment at least partially because he was aware that no one else had. And this pattern of neglect continues to the present day. Even a work like Frederick Jameson's Fables of Aggression, which focuses on the political implications of Lewis's work, mentions The Art of Being Ruled only once in passing. Part of the neglect has stemmed from the work's unavailability. Since the English and American editions of 1926, The Art of Being Ruled has been reprinted only once, in 1972 by Haskell House.
E. W. F. Tomlin, in his fine anthology of Lewis's prose published almost 20 years ago, Wyndham Lewis, an anthology of his prose, drew more heavily from The Art of Being Ruled than from any other of Lewis's books, defending his choice by saying that he preferred to concentrate on work unlikely to be reissued.
I hope that this edition, in happily disproving Tomlin's prophecy, will bring the book to a wider audience simply by making it more available. But clearly availability is not the only issue. When all else is said and done, The Art of Being Ruled remains a difficult book. And having addressed its place in Lewis's canon and its non-reception, I would like to turn now to a closer look at the book itself. What difficulties does it cast in our way and how do we negotiate them? One small difficulty is simply the unfamiliarity of an English-speaking readership with Lewis's largely French cultural frame of reference. Geoffrey Wagner many years ago tried to argue, in Wyndham Lewis, A Portrait of the Artist as the Enemy, 1957, that Lewis wasn't a very original thinker and that his ideas came from the French neoclassical school of the 1920s. This is a line of argument stimulated by Eliot's commendation of The Art of Being Ruled and by the fact that Lewis's contributions to the Criterion appeared in the context of work by and praise of Henri Massis, Jacques Maritain, Charles Maurras, and others. But Wagner is simply wrong, for Lewis's intellectual debts, unlike Eliot's, were less to contemporary developments in France than to the pre-war milieu in which he had intellectually, and artistically, come of age. This can be shown by the pattern of references in The Art of Being Ruled, which are less to the predominantly right-wing and post-war authors published in and praised by the Criterion than to a group of predominantly left-wing, pre-war writers clustered around Georges Sorel, termed by Lewis the key to all contemporary political thought. p. 119, Lewis lived in Paris on and off from 1903 to 1908. He spent part of every summer until World War I in France, and it is the intellectual climate of that period that was formative in his development. Root Assignment shows this as clearly as anything else, for there a quarter-century after The Art of Being Ruled he returns to the work of Benda, Sorel, and Edward Berth. This means that The Art of Being Ruled has some unfamiliar references that I have tried to explicate in the notes and index, but it doesn't establish Lewis's lack of originality, as Wagner claimed. A useful analogy from our own day would be the influence of French structuralist and post-structuralist thought on contemporary Anglo-American intellectuals. A literary critic working today might cite Derrida, Foucault, Lévi-Strauss, Althusser, Lacan, Greimas, Todorov, Lyotard, Kristeva, and many others in the way Lewis cites his French sources. 60 years from now, some of those names will be as familiar as Bergson or Sorel, but the rest will stand as much in need of assiduous footnoting as Berth, Johannit, Laban, and others Lewis cites. An intellectual debt does not preclude originality, as is shown in the contemporary case by the numerous claims that recent American critics have misunderstood or have been unfaithful to their French sources. And my reading of Lewis's French sources for this edition has led me to a diametrically opposite conclusion from Wagner's. I have been left with a reinforced impression that Lewis was an astonishingly original and powerful thinker, who uses sources and admits intellectual debts in a responsible way, but whose concerns and ways of working are unique. To put it another way, there is nothing else quite like the art of being ruled. That difficulty aside, a larger one remains. A. Richards described the Childermass in terms that also describe the experience of reading The Art of Being Ruled. We don't know, to an agonizing degree we are not allowed to know, what it is all about. The Art of Being Ruled is a tremendously detailed survey of contemporary life and socialist theory. Discussions of feminism, homosexuality, and changes in contemporary fashion are juxtaposed with discussions of the political ideas of Proudhon and Sorel and Bertrand Russell. Parts of the book seem impressively researched while others seem breezy and haphazard, as Lewis quotes newspaper articles or popular studies that obviously just came to his hand while writing a particular section. This disparity of materials creates bewildering and disorienting shifts in emphasis and tone. The reader is in a labyrinth of the author's creation, and he has to trust Lewis that the seeming disorder of his reading experience is in the service of a deeper order, or perhaps a disorder worth experiencing. This should sound familiar, and one of the keys to reading The Art of Being Ruled is recognizing that it is a modernist work, dense, elusive, and difficult, constructed on principles closer to those of the Waste Land or the Cantos in its shifts of register and its use of montage or juxtaposition than to those of a conventional treatise on politics and society. But there is a tension inherent in that identification, for though one might want to argue that Eliot's and Pound's poems are ultimately as concerned with making a point about society as The Art of Being Ruled, their generic status as poems means that we do not ask them to deliver their points as quickly or as clearly as we would a non-fictional work. The Art of Being Ruled is nearly as oblique as The Waste Land, but in Lewis's case most readers will have a lower threshold of impatience with such obliqueness. It is really remarkably difficult for most of the book to define Lewis's position on the issues he is discussing. He constantly judges the phenomena he discusses, but he does so from a shifting, mobile perspective. One thing that seems obvious throughout most of The Art of Being Ruled is Lewis's opposition to even hatred of homosexuality. Yet Lewis throws out a statement now and then indicating that he thinks that the explosion of homosexuality in the 1920s is not at all a bad thing. It is many things that do not recommend it. But it is impossible not to agree that, placed as Europe is at present, it is a useful institution. p. 267. More damaging to Lewis is the work's evasiveness with regards to the political questions it discusses at length. The Art of Being Ruled assumes a largely socialist landscape, and the bulk of the book is a careful if critical examination of socialist theory and claims. However, the one chapter of The Art of Being Ruled every study of Lewis cites, Fascism as an Alternative, leaves a rather different impression. Lewis, after stating that in the abstract I believe the Sovietic system to be the best, argues that for Anglo-Saxon countries as they are constituted today some modified form of fascism would probably be the best. Pages 320-21. Now, how does one take this casual suggestion, not developed by Lewis outside of this one isolated chapter? Is this the real voice of Lewis, Jameson's modernist as fascist, breaking through here? Or is it a chapter he casually threw in and later had cause to regret? Either reading is possible, and both are disturbing, for in place of a unified treatise, we seem to have a text at war with itself, incapable of articulating a unified perspective or point of view. There is a method to Lewis's madness, I would like to argue, and Lewis himself offered some hints of it retrospectively in Root Assignment, in a chapter on The Art of Being Ruled that is still the best piece of writing on the book. Writing a quarter century afterwards, Lewis wrote that The Art of Being Ruled is not an easy book to write about, because its argument bursts out into manifold byways. There is a further complication. It was my idea at the outset, inspired by the Hegelian dialectic, with its thesis and antithesis, to state, here and there, both sides of the question to be debated, and allow these opposites to struggle in the reader's mind for the ascendancy and there to find their synthesis. I did not take this very far, vestiges of it nevertheless exist, a source of occasional embarrassment. Now, this passage itself isn't as clear as one would wish, and in fact it works exactly as The Art of Being Ruled does in Lewis's description. A claim is advanced and then cancelled, so that we are not exactly sure where we stand. Is The Art of Being Ruled organized on some sort of mysterious Hegelian lines or not? Lewis won't tell us, in any definitive way, in precisely the way he doesn't deliver a position, A fixed standpoint, in the very book he is describing here. But why should we expect such clarity? This is a book on the art of being ruled, after all, and any author is, as the etymology tells us, the authority, the ruler in the cosmos he creates. No ruler in the contemporary world tells the ruled what he is up to. Or rather, he constantly tells them what he is up to, through the various organs of publicity, what we have come to call the media, but what he says is never the truth. The truth always has to be hidden, whether it is good or bad. In itself it causes alarm, any truth is impossible to utter. p. 201, The Art of Being Ruled works in the same way, in the cagey, Machiavellian manner of the modern ruler, so that to read it is to experience what it is like to be ruled. We are constantly being given information, arguments, and reasoned explanations of what is going on, but we always have to assess these things critically, for we don't know how they are to be taken. Nothing in the modern political world is to be taken at surface value, for everything has already been manipulated, is already coded in some way or another, and bears another significance from the obvious. Lewis presents himself as the great decoder of these events, the demystifier of all the mysteries of the modern world, but he needs to be decoded and read very carefully in turn. The closing words of the book are a quotation from Parmenides. I wish to communicate this view of the world to you exactly as it manifests itself, and so no human opinion will ever be able to get the better of you. So Lewis demystifies with a point, he wants no one to be able to take advantage of his reader again. And to accomplish that, Lewis gives his reader a crash course in the kind of deception that flourishes in the modern world. It is therefore up to that reader to separate the wheat from the chaff in Lewis's discourse, to follow the manifold byways of his argument, and sort things out for himself. This sounds like an extreme strategy, but Lewis would argue that the times demand it. We live in a time in which the forces of publicity are all-powerful, and a mass society has been created which can be manipulated at will, through advertisements, through fads, through publicity, through culture. And any reader of The Art of Being Ruled has to grant that Lewis is one of the shrewdest and most penetrating observers of the media found in our century. Much of his critique rhymes with recent Marxist critiques of the commodification and reification found in late capitalism, but no Marxist thinker I am familiar with has had such a sharp eye for the surfaces of modern life. When confronted with any of the absurdities of contemporary life, with the fads that suddenly sweep us so that thousands of people demand to express their individuality in exactly the same way, with a president who claims to want to get government off the people's back but who wants an increasing number of citizens to undergo polygraph tests and urinalysis, with advocates of sexual liberation who confuse liberation and sexual promiscuity, I have often wished for a moment that Lewis were still alive so that he could lambaste yet another absurdity. But that feeling rarely lasts for more than a moment, as I quickly realize that he has already written about it, that somewhere in his work he saw this tendency 50 or 60 years ahead of its full flowering and denounced it with all the vividness and ferocity that makes his work so powerful. With minor variations, we still live in the society Lewis depicted, and his vivid portrait of an attack on our society and our values in The Art of Being Ruled is still astonishingly contemporary and up-to-date. This is of course why no one reads The Art of Being Ruled, though it is also why we should read it. In Eliot's words, humankind cannot bear very much reality. We are all attacked by Lewis, and we tend to prefer less harsh, more flattering visions of ourselves. But Lewis's primary object of attack is more focused than I have represented it so far. It is the way a false rhetoric of individualism increasingly masks a groupthink that is the very opposite of individualism. Modern society is increasingly defined, according to Lewis, by a series of wars. Of course, the nation war of World War I had just ended, killing off millions in a quarrel sparked by an inane nationalism, but that war is more the backdrop to Lewis's analysis than its centerpiece. 3 other wars occupy more of Lewis's attention, perhaps needing more attention since the idiocy of the nation war seemed fully apparent after 1918. These are the class war, the sex war, and the age war. And the bulk of The Art of Being Ruled is devoted to a critical examination of the ideologies behind these various wars, socialism, feminism, and the cults of the child and of homosexuality. Thus, the disparate, manifold byways Lewis explores in The Art of Being Ruled aren't as disparate as they seem, all of them being aspects of one or the other of the wars being fought in modern society. Lewis sees a common pattern behind all these wars. The rhetoric employed in these wars is entirely individualistic. The homosexual or the feminist activist says that his or her individuality is being suppressed by an oppressive social structure, in just the way that a revolutionary proletarian or a revolutionary nationalist argues against capitalism or the occupying power. But the net effect of these simultaneously waged wars is not at all individualistic, for people are defined less and less in terms of who they are in themselves and more in terms of their membership in a warring party or parties. So the net result of all this self-expression is, paradoxically, that people are more and more highly organized into rigid groups. The truth is that such an individual is induced to express his personality because it is desired absolutely to standardize him and get him to rub off, in the process of the expression, any rough edges that may remain from his untaught, spontaneous days. Drawn into one orbit or another, he must in the contemporary world submit himself to one of several mechanical socially organized rhythms. It needs to be made clear that Lewis is not particularly concerned with choosing a side in any of these wars. He is not attacking feminism or socialism or homosexuality. But he never endorses them either. Either move would be to take these wars more seriously than he thinks they deserve. For one simple question continues to bother him: why are these wars being waged with such ferocity at the present time? Why are young people suddenly turning with such hatred on the older generations and thinking of generations as dominating and oppressed classes? Why are women now thinking of themselves as collectively oppressed by men and in need of liberation? Why has there been such an increase in homosexuality, or at least in its visibility, a phenomenon Lewis relates to feminism and its attack on man as the oppressor? For Lewis, a simple, common-sense answer like women are oppressed and are only now realizing it won't do because that shows too uncritical an acceptance of surfaces. Lewis always hopes to induce in the reader a more critical attitude towards appearances. He wants us to ask, what is behind this development? Who stands to gain? True to his method elsewhere, Lewis gives us more than one answer to this question. At points in The Art of Being Ruled, his position seems to be that no one is really behind it, that it is simply the expression of a larger collective mentality that no one controls. That this fanatical and grandiose conception is not necessarily tucked away inside the head of any subordinate official of this vast change, or shared even by all its promoters, is no doubt true. But nothing short of such a conception can adequately account for its scope, implacability, and power. Or elsewhere. When these popular movements of thought, expressing themselves as highly infectious fashions, are described as theories, it is not meant that they are a body of formulated social doctrine, of course, but rather an instinctive and unconscious process, which is only a theory, properly speaking, for the observer. But from the Lucretian watchtower we are possessing for the moment we are able to formulate for ourselves this pattern of instinctive behavior observed, into an intelligible system of life. This is a line of argument likely to be attractive to us today, for Lewis's claim here to describe a cast of mind or intellectual structure larger than any individual is essentially proto-structuralist. But Lewis does not leave it there, for he wants to look at the causes of the phenomena he observes. If Lewis were to ascribe a single root cause for the revolutionary mentality sweeping modern society that demands that all structures of authority be struck down, it would surely be science, as The Art of Being Ruled opens with some prescient remarks about how science and technology in their constant change and improvement are models for all other kinds of revolutionary change in our society. In this spirit, The Art of Being Ruled, with its attention to the increasing mechanization and rationalization of society through such things as fashion, the newspapers, and other organs of mass society, can be seen as a brilliant study of the refashioning of society on technical lines. Marshall McLuhan certainly read Lewis this way, for McLuhan's studies of technology and the media that had such an impact in the 1960s drew heavily on Lewis's work, though after The Mechanical Bride, 1951, McLuhan tended to replace Lewis's critical tone with a greater optimism about technology. Purged anew of that optimistic tone as well as of McLuhan's pop cultural flair, this is the vision of Lewis likely to prove most attractive today. Seen in this light, he is almost a one-man Frankfurt School of the right, brilliantly exposing the machinery of reification in ways that are still of great interest today. And though Frederick Jameson's study of Lewis could have been strengthened, as I have already argued, by a greater awareness of the art of being ruled, this view of Lewis is essentially the one presented in his work. But the proto-structuralist Lewis, who saw only a mentality inculcated by science behind the wars that permeate our society, coexists with another Lewis less easily accommodated to our contemporary viewpoints. Lewis's enduring suspicion was that the fanatical and grandiose conception he describes on p.76 is tucked inside someone's head, that the various wars he analyzed were in fact being manipulated and promoted by various nefarious forces. The wars were simply shell games, designed to distract our attention from the ever more powerful tendencies towards centralization, homogenization, and control. He argues quite straightforwardly that the sex war is being controlled and manipulated from without. The object of the capital O socialist promoters of the sex war was dual. The breakup of this expensive and useless unit, the family, and the releasing of the hordes of idle women, waiting on little kings, for industrial purposes, was the principal object. Lewis argued on good Marxian lines that as women demanded to have jobs, wage competition was inevitably increasing, and wages were going down. This benefited women less than it did employers, and Lewis decided that the employers must therefore be behind the feminist movement. Just as armament manufacturers encourage war and are war profiteers, capitalists benefiting from low wages are sex war profiteers. Moreover, this successful organization of society into a war zone leads, as it always does, both to a greater degree of economic efficiency or rationalization and a greater degree of control. The apparently casual connections among the various wars discussed in The Art of Being Ruled, therefore, aren't casual at all. These disparate phenomena are really linked by certain secret machinations. And the end result is an increasing centralization of power underneath the democratic surface of life in the West. Now, this is a theory of society that makes for some great fiction, and Lewis's conspiracy theories and concern with faking and false surfaces permeate his novels, from his first, The Potboiler Mrs. Duke's Millions, written around 1910 but never published in Lewis's lifetime, to the three marvelous achievements of the 1930s, Snooty Baronet, 1932, The Revenge for Love, 1937, and The Vulgar Streak, 1940. Timothy Materer has convincingly argued that Lewis's preoccupations and conceptions are close to those of much contemporary American fiction, specifying Thomas Pynchon's concept of operational paranoia as relevant to Lewis's way of seeing the world. 5. Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, and William Gaddis's The Recognitions could also be mentioned in this regard, as could the novels of Céline. Paranoia can be enabling for a novelist. But in a work of non-fiction such as The Art of Being Ruled, Lewis's overarching conspiracy theories do not carry much conviction. In his novels, we can choose to take them as metaphors, but they aren't presented as metaphors in The Art of Being Ruled. And his analysis of what is wrong with contemporary culture is simply too devastatingly detailed and accurate for him to be able to persuade us that a specific group of manipulators is responsible for all these ills. Lewis is brilliant at reading surfaces and at revealing them to be surfaces, and I think his critique of the hollow liberation offered by the various wars is prophetic and largely correct. But, true to his first vocation of painting, he isn't as good at getting behind those surfaces. Depth in his work is mostly an interesting illusion, and no one, I think, is likely to be convinced by his hints that what seems to be chaos is really carefully organized behind the scenes. Even those of us who admire Lewis greatly should admit that he is wrong here. And from this mistaken premise, he drew an ever more mistaken conclusion, one that he later explicitly rejected. His premise about contemporary liberal society, as I have sketched it, is that its apparent openness and freedom is simply an appearance. Underneath, we are as tightly controlled as we can be. Therefore, all of the talk about democratic liberties is just that talk, part of a gigantic fraud perpetrated by the rulers behind the scenes that has hoodwinked us all. What he then concluded was that we would be better off without the pretense, that it would save us all time and energy if we admitted that we were all being ruled. From this standpoint, The Art of Being Ruled argues that we would be better off living in a regime that made no pretense about being democratic. The two such regimes that had been recently established in Europe were the Soviet Union and Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy, and in The Art of Being Ruled Lewis states his preference for these two less hypocritical and therefore more honest regimes. How one interprets Lewis's equation of communist Russia and fascist Italy depends, of course, at least partially on one's own opinion in these matters. Most readers of Lewis, influenced by the explicit anti-communism of later Lewis works such as The Revenge for Love, have seen the interest in fascism, not the interest in communism, as fundamental, and Lewis has certainly suffered from a reputation as a lifelong fascist sympathizer. But more attention paid to The Art of Being Ruled would modify that impression, I think, since Lewis presents fascism in The Art of Being Ruled as a movement within socialism rather than as a right-wing alternative to it. All Marxian doctrine, all atavism or collectivism conforms very nearly in practice to the fascist ideal. Fascismo is merely a spectacular Marinettian flourish put onto the tail, or, if you like, the head of Marxism. There is of course a sense in which this is true, as well as some senses in which it isn't. Mussolini started out as a socialist, drew heavily upon heterodox socialist thinkers such as Sorel, and at least at the start of the fascist period argued that fascism was the true heir of socialism. Sorel in turn repaid the compliment, for his final political enthusiasms before his death in 1922 were Mussolini's fascism and Lenin's Bolshevism. He saw them in the same perspective, as movements to be praised for their reaction against the mediocrity of bourgeois life. So Lewis's conflation of Leninism and fascism shouldn't be too quickly dismissed, and I would argue that Lewis's stated preference for Lenin's Russia or Mussolini's Italy is not, as Jameson would have it, the preference of a fascist secretly opposed to Marxism but for some strange reason pretending otherwise, but rather the preference of an anti-democratic thinker looking for any alternative to the falsity he saw displayed in the contemporary democracies of the West. So I don't think we should criticize Lewis at this point for being a fascist thinker. He spends much more time criticizing the West than in praising alternatives. He spends much more time discussing socialism in its mainstream Marxist form than its fascist variant. And the central focus of the book is the detailed critique of the wars in contemporary, liberal society. It is also clear from The Art of Being Ruled that, though he admired the dictators for their willingness to talk about power, he didn't think they would ever use it. But we need not invoke this Timur-like figure of Asiatic despotism, as he, at all events, will not arrive for some time, if ever. The harsh and ominous words, ruler and ruled, although they must be used, are in practice infinitely tempered to the shorn lamb of our educationalist era. Education plays, and will continue to play, a much more important part in government than physical and exterior force. However, though this passage offers an interesting contemporary parallel to Antonio Gramsci's stress on the importance of hegemony as opposed to physical force, it is nonetheless a tragically inaccurate prediction of the behavior of the rulers Lewis was praising. So what we really need to criticize Lewis for at this point is not his preference for fascism but his failure to inform himself about either fascism or Leninism. Lewis's stance at this point is less a positive endorsement of fascism than a critique of the status quo in the West that takes the form of even fascism has to be better than this. But he was not at all well informed about this alternative he endorses in this offhand fashion. That this was a particularly unfortunate form for Lewis's critique to take no one ultimately understood better than Lewis himself. It took him a while to understand this, however, as his political works of the 1930s, vastly less perceptive and more simplistically right-wing than The Art of Being Ruled, tend to be largely reactions against the nonsense he perceived around him. If Lewis's principle wasn't exactly evil, be thou my good, it was something like, whatever Bloomsbury considers evil, be thou my good. And this reactive stance against leftist cant is much less subtle and interesting than the complex argument of The Art of Being Ruled. But as it became clear that the practice of fascist rule across the 1930s was not tempered to the shorn lamb of our educationalist era, Lewis backed away from his earlier praise of fascism as an alternative. But the damage to his reputation had been done, and Jameson's term the modernist as fascist captures the way Lewis has been seen ever since. There are a number of ironies attendant here. The first is that Lewis is the only modernist whose commitment to fascism has been overplayed, not underplayed, and there is a clear distinction that hasn't been sufficiently recognized between the increasing commitment of Lewis's friend Ezra Pound to fascism and Lewis's own evolution away from an anti-democratic position. Pound's concern was increasingly the art of ruling. He wanted to help shape a totalitarian state. In contrast, Lewis's remained the art of being ruled, even at the height of his anti-democratic thinking. His concern was not power over others but rather the increasingly marginal position of art and the artist in the modern world. The second irony is that, although Stalin butchered as many people as Hitler and made Mussolini look like an amateur, if Lewis had developed the nascent socialism of The Art of Being Ruled in a left-wing, pro-Bolshevik direction, his reputation wouldn't have been damaged at all. But to make that point, no matter how justly, is to fall into the trap Lewis fell into in the 1930s, which is to justify one's own position solely by criticizing someone else's. It is to Lewis's great credit, again, in contrast to Pound, that he kept reassessing his political perspective as events changed and moved away from the simplistic positions of the 1930s polemics. The full complexity of Lewis's evolution cannot be traced here, but two changes in his position stand out and are worth a brief mention. First, Lewis realized by the end of his life that he couldn't live in the Lucretian watchtower above the human herd that he claims as his standpoint in The Art of Being Ruled. As his own analysis should have shown him, there can be no opting out of the categories of ruler and ruled, and his claim to adopt an objective viewpoint above the fray was not sustainable. Second, Lewis realized that his preference for the despots because they had no fine ideals they failed to live up to was a tragic mistake. Having ideals around is useful even if we only occasionally try to live up to them. That occasional memory makes an important difference. In contrast to the demythologizing stance of earlier works of Lewis, America and Cosmic Man, 1948, the most important of the later political books as The Art of Being Ruled is of the earlier ones, articulates the ideal of cosmic man, beyond national boundaries and the petty disputes that come with those boundaries. So in these crucial respects, Lewis learned from his own mistakes and grew in stature accordingly. But the later work builds on the earlier work even as it revises it. The ideal of cosmic man is implicit in Lewis's critique in The Art of Being Ruled of the various wars that plague modern society. Moreover, the Lewis of the fine, late works such as America and Cosmic Man and the Human Age retains much of the penetration and the acerbity of the Lewis of The Art of Being Ruled. All that he has lost, or sloughed off, is what is most objectionable about the stance of the 1926 volume. The Art of Being Ruled, therefore, is not a perfect book, and there is much in it that will offend and disturb its readers. But we don't look to Lewis for perfect books, we look to him precisely to be offended and disturbed out of our complacencies. And understood in that light, The Art of Being Ruled is a fascinating book, still bursting with energy and insights, and a book that is yet to find the readership it deserves.